Shannon, this real estate market's been crazy. What if during the transaction, the buyer changes, let's say from a conventional to a VA or FHA, or maybe even just from a conventional 20% down to a conventional 5% down?
So the contract does address changes in financing, and what it says is that the buyer will immediately notify the seller of any of those changes. And then they will have the seller's written consent if those changes were to do one of three things, one of any of these. So they would either, if it increased the seller's costs for any reason, or delayed closing for any reason, or potentially affects their ability to actually qualify without prior to doc conditions. So if it does one of those things, the buyer would also need to have the seller's consent, written consent, in order to make those changes. Otherwise, if it doesn't change anything for the seller or affect them in any way negatively, then the buyer can make those changes as long as they can get that loan done and it doesn't cost anyone anything extra.
Yeah, I would probably make sure that before the seller gave that consent, that there was proof that they can now go to that other type of financing.
Right. You would want to get a new pre-qualification. You'd want to get a new loan status update right away. Find out if it affects the appraisal, if they have to order new appraisals at all. And there's a lot of things I think a seller would want to do due diligence wise to investigate that for sure once they receive that notice. But those are the buyer's options. They have the right to shop during the transaction as long as it doesn't cost anyone anything.
So let's just spin this a little bit. Okay. What if they just changed lenders and they didn't tell you, and you're still getting your loan status reports from lender A, but now they moved to lender B, and it could be a whole different type of loan.
Right. Well, and that comes down to the same thing where they do have to, regardless of anything else, they do have to immediately notify the seller of any of those changes. So either in the financing terms, if they've changed from the pre-qual or the loan status update that's previously provided, or in the lender themselves, if they've changed companies, that sort of thing. They would have to immediately notify the seller.
So to make this even longer, let's say they forgot to notify the agent or the seller, right? And they've gone from a conventional financing now to VA financing. And maybe there's some requirements that VA wants now. It could be thousands of dollars in repairs to maybe the roof or grading or earth to wood contact. What obligation is, what is the seller's obligation? Because they were not noticed and now they're being
negatively impacted.
Yeah, negatively impacted.
I think I think the buyer would be responsible for making sure that the seller has no effect on them. So the buyer would be responsible for those kind of conditions potentially. The buyer would be responsible if there was some kind of a delay and that cost the seller. And it has happened. I'm not going to say it hasn't happened. Thankfully, in the couple of instances I've had, they were able to close. It didn't impact the seller, but I could see where that would be a challenge. And the contract, I think at that point, the seller could cure the buyer for a non-compliance, and then they would have 3 days to somehow make that right. And at the end, if they weren't able to, it could potentially be a breach, and the seller could make a demand for the earnest money and cancel.
Excellent, Mike. What if the only stipulation was after the Binzer and after all the repairs were agreed to, now because their VA requires on the termite inspection that there's some wood rot, and now we have thousands of dollars worth of wood rot in the eaves of a house?
That's going to come down to negotiating, and then at that point the buyer and seller are going to have to make a decision, because the challenge that's going to happen is that the seller is not responsible to fix that, but then the buyer can't qualify without it. And so similar to when appraisal conditions come up, maybe the value comes in, but maybe now there's still that roof certification that's needed. It's that same thing. There has to be some negotiations, and somehow getting to a win-win between the parties is really the best you can do. And determining who's going to cover those costs. Maybe it's now that the seller will complete the items, but the buyer is going to have to be paying some concessions to the seller for that, and some sort of a credit through the escrow to make that happen, or to offset those costs to the seller. I mean, that's where you just have to get into some negotiation.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.